Thank you. I appreciate your time. I'm going to go right to our guests and their opening statements. This is a debate, so I hope we'll have a lively discussion. It's a very interesting topic. First up, to give us just a very brief introduction and an opening statement of about 3 minutes, because we have a shorter time here than we'd like, but we're going to make the best of it. Robert Spencer is the director of Jihad Watch, a project of David Horowitz's Freedom Center. Spencer is a writer and researcher who has written 6 books, 8 monographs, and more than 100 articles about jihad and Islamic terrorism. His latest book is the New York Times bestseller, The Truth About Muhammad. He also is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades. In addition to Islam Unveiled, disturbing questions about the world's fastest growing faith, and Onward Muslim Soldiers, How Jihad Still Threatens America and the West. Please welcome Robert Spencer.
Thank you very much. The topic today before us is stated as, is religious extremism or secular extremism the problem? Actually, this is a difficult topic to argue, because if you argue that religious extremism rather than secular extremism is the problem, then it sounds as if you are in favor of Jerry Springer and bald-headed pop-singing tarts and things like that, when actually the case is neither religious extremism or secular extremism is the problem, but rather, quite clearly, from the statements of those who are fighting against us, the problem is Islamic jihad. Islamic jihad is an imperative rooted within the Islamic religion. Jihad means struggle in Arabic. The only meaning of jihad is not military. However, there are an abundance of passages from the Quran, the Muslim holy book, and the Hadith, the traditions of Muhammad, as well as all the teachings of the teachings of all the schools of Islamic law, that stipulate that it is part of the responsibility of the Muslim community to wage war against unbelievers in order to establish over them the hegemony of Islamic law. This is not the twisted Wahhabi version of a tiny minority of extremists. It is taught by all the schools of Islamic jurisprudence, and all the sects of Islam that are considered orthodox by Muslims hold to this view. Now, the question before us really, however, is why is it that we're seeing an explosion of this kind of activity over the last quarter century, when if you went back before that to the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, you didn't see Islamic jihad terrorism dominating the headlines the way you do today. And the contention of Mr. D'Souza, I don't mean to, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure you will, is that the depravity of American popular culture has, among other things, contributed to a feeling among Muslims worldwide that they are threatened, that their traditional cultures are threatened, and that therefore they have to lash out. There is actually some truth to that. There's no doubt that the depravity of American pop culture is indeed used as a pretext by the Islamic jihadists. However, it must be borne in mind that the Islamic jihad has always been pursued whenever Muslim states and communities have had the means to pursue it. They did not have that means until the last 25 years in the modern era, until the Saudis struck oil. The Khomeini revolution in Iran gave a tremendous impetus to the jihadists, because it showed them that they could govern a state. They could win and govern a state. The Saudis have been incredibly instrumental in funding jihad activity worldwide. And this is the ultimate reason why we're seeing this explode in the world today. Finally, the thing is this. The Islamic texts mandate warfare against unbelievers, not just immoral unbelievers, but all unbelievers, regardless of how moral or wonderful they may be.
Thank you, Mr. Spencer. Next up, our next guest is Mr. Dinesh D'Souza. Mr. D'Souza is the Robert and Karen Rishwain Fellow at the Hoover Institution. His articles in culture and politics have appeared in Vanity Fair, Forbes, Harper's, The Wall Street Journal, Atlantic Monthly, and The Washington Post, and The New York Times. In his most recent book, The Enemy at Home, The Cultural Left and Its Responsibility for 9/11, which is a New York Times bestseller list, and he'll be signing this book at the Young Americans Foundation Room right after this session. So please, he's also written What's So Great About America, Letters to a Young Conservative, The Virtue of Prosperity, and Ronald Reagan, How an Ordinary Man Became an Extraordinary Leader. Please welcome Dinesh D'Souza.
Thank you very much. I know my time is very limited, and so in my opening remarks I will adopt the motto that King Henry VIII used with one of his wives. He said, "I won't keep you long." If you look at the insurgency in Iraq, and you look at why there is a smell of victory on the part of our enemies in Iraq, it is not because they can beat the U.S. military over there. It is because, if you look at our enemies in Iraq, the reason they feel a sense of victory is not because they are capable of defeating the U.S. military, but because they know that in America, support for the war hangs in the balance. In other words, the Iraqi insurgents know that there is an active secular left in this country that is trying to convince the Congress and ultimately the president to get out. So if they win in Iraq, it will not simply be because of their efforts, but also because of the collaborative help that the enemy abroad is getting, if you will, from the enemy at home. Now, some people have taken my book to be saying, in a sense, that because I'm pointing a finger at the cultural left, that I'm denying in some inane way that bin Laden and his co-conspirators knocked down the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. They did it. But it is not an unintelligent question to ask, what are the conditions that put radical Islam in a position to be strong enough and emboldened enough to carry out that attack? Wasn't it the policies of Jimmy Carter in withdrawing American support for the Shah that helped install the Khomeini regime in place? Wasn't it the impotence, if that's the right word, of the Clinton administration in the 1990s that emboldened bin Laden? By his own token, he says, we were emboldened when we saw the cowardly response of the Americans to strike. Now, I want to make a point about this issue of cultural depravity. There are two groups in the Muslim world. There are the radical Muslims, and there are the traditional Muslims. One thing I'm going to be arguing is that we cannot win the war on terror without driving a wedge between these two camps. Ultimately, traditional Islam is the recruiting pool of radical Islam. Only by dividing those two groups can we win long term. Thank you.
Thank you, Dinesh. I'm going to go to you with the first question, and that is your book, and having reviewed your book, you lay a lot at the feet of the liberals and the left. And while I may not be crazy about liberals and the left, I'd be hard-pressed to blame them for what 19 hijackers did on 9/11. Care to comment?
If one were trying to understand the rise of Nazism and Hitler's invasion of Poland and France, it would not be an unintelligent question to ask, what role did European appeasement in the 1930s play in consolidating the position of Hitler and emboldening him to do what he did? If it was not for the appeasement of the Europeans, maybe Hitler would not have taken the steps that he did. So my argument is that radical Islam, once a very marginal force in Islamic society, has gained enormous traction in the last couple of decades. One reason for it is liberal foreign policy, which has strengthened the position of radical Islam. The other reason is that liberal values projected abroad. And I'm not just talking about Britney Spears, by the way, or Hollywood. I am talking about an aggressive global campaign on the part of international leftist groups to promote secularism, feminism, homosexuality, all kinds of ideas that, look, we can debate them here in America, but when you go outside of America, to Africa, to Asia, to China, to India, to the Muslim world, these are seen as a shameless and shocking assault on the values of people who live in very traditional societies. So we've gotten a backlash from that.
Thank you, Dinesh. In reading your books, Mr. Spencer, you contended, as you did in your opening statement, that devout Muslims are commanded in every school of thought to fight and even indeed kill non-believers. I was never taught that growing up as a Muslim. As a matter of fact, I read in the Quran, do not contend with the people of the book.
I didn't say that.
Except, okay, well, in the fairest way. So what did you say, and what can you explain that comment?
Yeah, in the first place, though, I'd like to say a couple things are not at issue here. I don't think that it's any point of debate or that Mr. D'Souza and I have any disagreement over the disastrous policies of the Carter administration or the disastrous policies of appeasement that are being pursued by the cultural left. Those things, sure, we are 100% in agreement. What we're in disagreement about is the prospects of these traditional Muslims who we are urged to ally with. I'm just not sure that they want to ally with us. And this is getting back to your question, Mr. Khan. Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, told his followers, and this is in a hadith, Sahih Muslim 4294, if you'd like to look it up, is he told them to meet the unbelievers, invite them to Islam. If they refuse the invitation to Islam, then to offer them the second-class status of the Dhimma, the protected group, the so-called protected people who are second-class citizens and denied equality of rights under the law with Muslims, or third, to go to war with them if they refuse both conversion or subjugation. These things are taught in all the schools of Islamic law to this day. This doesn't mean that every Muslim holds to them, and this is where we come back to the traditional Muslims. When I asked Mr. D'Souza in an earlier engagement if he could name a traditional Muslim, he gave me Ali Goma, the Mufti of Egypt. Unfortunately, the Mufti of Egypt has issued a statement in support of Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a terrorist group. Hassan Nasrallah, the head of the Hezbollah, is on video shouting death to America. I doubt that that's really a very fruitful possibility for alliance.
Thank you, Mr. D'Souza.
I'm Spencer.
Sorry, Mr. Spencer. Mr. D'Souza, Mr. Spencer is contending that we would have difficulty in the West with aligning with traditional Muslims. Is that, in fact, something that is impossible, or what's your argument?
Historically, I think that the error that Spencer makes, if I may say so, is he ransacks the Quran. He finds all the violent passages in it. He ignores all the peaceful passages in it. He looks at the early conquering zeal of Islam for the first few hundred years, starting about the 7th century. Then he fast forwards, jumping over about 1,000 years, right to the modern age, and he basically says, Bin Laden is right. Bin Laden is right in usurping and appropriating the entire Muslim tradition. When Bin Laden says, I'm doing nothing more than what the Quran says, Spencer is there applauding on the sidelines, because he agrees with the Bin Laden interpretation of Islam. Now look, unlike Spencer, I grew up in that world. I grew up in India, which has 200 million Muslims, almost as many as the entire Middle East. We often think of the typical Muslim as someone in a white sheet with little eyes staring through, living in Saudi Arabia. The largest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia. The second is Bangladesh. There are lots of Muslims in Turkey. So I think that what we are getting here is a distorted picture of the Muslim world, and it has disastrous consequences for us as conservatives, because when we go around attacking Islam, we are alienating traditional Muslims and pushing them into the radical camp by attacking their religion and their values.
Thank you, Mr. D'Souza. And just
Do I get to respond to that?
Feel free, take a minute.
Sure, thanks. The question here is what the content of Islamic teaching is, and that is a matter of objective record. I doubt that, with respect, that Mr. D'Souza has actually read any of my books, or he wouldn't make these claims that I'm picking out negative passages from the Quran and from Islamic tradition when I'm only reporting on what they say. I said in the beginning that the 4 Sunni schools of Islamic jurisprudence, the Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanbali, and Hanafi, as well as the Shiites, they all teach this thing. So in other words, it's not something that is just bin Ladenism. It is mainstream Islam. And the idea that we are attacking them by telling the truth about what Islamic teachings are, well, I think that's absurd.
Thank you. And I'll offer a rebuttal to Mr. D'Souza.
For every kill the infidels passage in the Quran, you can find a matching slay the infidels passage in the Old Testament. Don't interrupt me. Don't interrupt me. The issue I want to get at is not what the